Hello again. This is Lawrence Holgate, and this is episode 5 of Understanding John Stuart Mill's classic book, Utilitarianism. We have been through 3 objections now in chapter 2 of utilitarianism, 3 objections to the principle of utility. And Mill is doing this because he wants to clarify exactly what it is, and his strategy is simply to knock down each of the objections to show that they're all irrelevant. So tonight we're going to look at the objection that says that the utilitarian standard is too high for humans. We've already seen the first objection, if you recall, is that the utilitarian object is too low for humans. So it's somewhat surprising that the critics would say that it's now too high for humans. And it's argued that the utilitarian standard is too high for most persons to ever attain because of the moral requirement that we always act from the inducement of promoting the greatest good of all persons who might be affected by our conduct. The critic says that this just exacts too much. It's expecting too much from ordinary people. Mill responds to this criticism that it's too much for human beings to try to do. He responds that we should notice that this is the exact opposite of the objection we saw earlier, where it was said that the utilitarian theory of life was too low of a standard for human beings. And secondly, and this is important now, this objection confuses the rule of action with the motive of action. This is his most important reply, that the objector has confused the rule of action with the motive of action. And here's what he means. The utilitarian is not asking us to make judgments about right or wrong by considering the motive, that is, the inducement that propelled a person to do what she did. Instead, the theory demands only that one should do the act that promotes the greatest happiness. The application of the utilitarian rule has nothing to do with motive. Mill uses the example of saving someone from drowning. Suppose that the rescuer's only motive is the hope of getting a substantial reward for his efforts. And if asked whether the rescuer did the morally right thing by saving the rescued person's life, we wouldn't hesitate to say that he did do the right thing, even if we knew that the rescuer's motive was not a feeling of duty, but rather just pure old self-interest. He wanted that reward. Mill says this at page 17 of Utilitarianism, quote, "It is the business of ethics to tell us what are our duties, or by what test we may know them. But no system of ethics requires that the sole motive of all we do shall be a feeling of duty." In this case, the rescuer passed the utilitarian test. Despite his self-serving motive, he promoted the greatest happiness, and this is all that we need to know. Now, in a famous footnote, and if you look at page 18, it's footnote 2 in Mill's book, Utilitarianism. In that footnote, Mill considers an objection to the passage that I just quoted. The objector gives another rescue example that he argues can only be assessed as right or wrong by consideration of the motive with which the rescue was done. So this is another attempt to plug motive in as a necessary condition for saying that an action is morally obligatory or morally right or morally wrong. Suppose that a tyrant, when his enemy jumped into the sea to escape from him, saved him from drowning simply in order that he might inflict upon him more exquisite tortures. Would it tend to clearness to speak of that rescue as a morally right action? Now think about this. This tyrant has an enemy who jumps into the sea to escape, and this tyrant saved him from drowning. But he saved him from drowning only so he could inflict upon him more exquisite tortures. But would it tend to clearness to speak of that rescue as a morally right action? The point of the objector's example is to show first that we would not speak of this rescue as a morally right action, and second, this is because the malevolent motive of the tyrant's act of rescue is not to save the man's life, but rather it's to torture him. Mill's reply here makes a distinction between two actions, the rescue and the torture, where the rescue is a means to the torture. And if we see this in this way, then the rescue of the man is only the necessary first step of an act far more atrocious than leaving him to drown would have been. Page 18, in footnote 2. If we consider the act as a whole, that is, as an act of torture, then we would certainly not speak of it as a morally right act, and there would be no need to consult the tyrant's motive to arrive at this assessment. An application of the principle of utility is all that we need to determine wrongdoing. We don't need to know anything about motive. So says John Stuart Mill. Now, Mill makes a second point here. And here I'm reading, if you have the book, the paperback book, I'm at page 20, and it's section 2.2.3.2 at the bottom of the page. It has that heading, motive and intention. And this is Mill's second point. He writes that the objector has confounded the very different ideas of motive and intention. This really shows off Mill as an analytic philosopher, this section. The intention is what the agent wills to do. The motive is the feeling which makes him will so to do. The morality of the tyrant's act depends entirely upon the intentional act of torturing the enemy, that is, what he wills to do. The tyrant's motive, whatever it may be, makes no difference to estimating the morality of the act of torture. But, Mill says, motive may make a great difference in our moral estimation of the agent. Now, this is an important point. If we're trying to place some kind of moral estimation on the agent and not on the action, things might be different. If we return to Mill's original example, if it is asked, what makes it morally right to rescue the girl from drowning? We would refer to a rule of conduct, for example, utility, to answer that question. If it is also asked about the same person, why do they call him a bad person? We would answer by referring to his motive, the motive of collecting a reward. If a person causes harm to another unintentionally, let's say by mistake or by accident, we would count this as an excuse and not hold her responsible. It is different, though, with motive. If a poor person steals a loaf of bread from the baker and says that her motive was to feed my child, the baker would still hold her responsible for the theft. A benevolent motive is not an excuse. If the baker considers the thief's motive at all, it would be to decide the amount of blame or reparation. In this case, given the thief's plea of poverty, the baker might decide to do nothing and let her keep the bread she stole. So that is the conclusion of Mill's, I think now we're at the third or fourth criticism and reply. Let's look at the next one. This has the heading, and I'm reading at page 41, 2.2.4. The heading is, Utilitarians are frozen people. Mill writes this, it is said of utilitarianism, the critic says this of utilitarianism, that it renders men cold and unsympathizing, that it chills their moral feelings toward individuals, that it makes them regard only the dry and hard consideration of the consequences of actions, not taking into their moral estimate the qualities from which those actions emanate. End quote. Now, Mill replies that this objection, like the last one, misconceives the purpose of a standard of morality and of the very meaning of the words right and wrong. The purpose of a moral standard is to help us decide whether an action is right or wrong. And this is not decided by assessing the character of the person who did the act. We would not say of the person who rescues the drowning man that what he did is right or wrong because he is a good or bad person, still less because it is done by an amiable, brave, or benevolent man, or the contrary. Mill's point is that it is one thing to morally evaluate an act or omission. It is quite another to evaluate character. In the case of actions, we look to a moral standard, whether that standard is utility or the categorical imperative. In the case of character, we look to past conduct and to the motives that prompted the conduct. Martin Luther King is generally thought to be a good man, partly because of his tireless efforts to promote racial equality and because his motive for this was always a benevolent regard for the welfare of racial minorities. Let's move on. Let's go to another criticism and reply. This one is at section 2.2.5, and it's the objector saying that utilitarianism is a godless doctrine. Now, utilitarians back in that day, in Mill's day, in the 19th century, got clobbered time and time again for promoting a doctrine that has nothing to do with God. And so Mill wants to answer this, that it's a godless doctrine. And I think he'll be surprised by what he says. The objection that utilitarianism is a godless doctrine can be interpreted in several ways. If God's purpose in creating human beings was that they achieve happiness, then Mill says utility is not only not a godless doctrine, but it's more profoundly religious than any other. Now let me back up and say that again. If we assume that the purpose of God in creating human beings was that they achieve happiness, then utility, the principle of utility, is not only not a godless doctrine, but it's more religious than any other doctrine. Now, by godless, the critic might mean that utilitarianism does not recognize the revealed will of God as the supreme law of morals. Mill replies that those utilitarians who also believe in the existence of God necessarily believe that his desire is for human creations to always act to produce the greatest happiness. The utilitarian principle must be the supreme law of a God who is defined as perfectly good and wise. So he's just turning the whole thing around. He's saying, look, if you believe in a God who is good and wise, then you're going to have to believe that this God wants to achieve happiness for human beings, and happiness, of course, is at the very basis, the very foundation of the utility principle. And here's another one. I think we're coming to the next to last. Expediency and acting on principle. The objectors to the utilitarian theory sometimes accuse it of being an immoral doctrine, because it recommends doing what is expedient instead of acting on principle. And they say that's not what morality is all about. Morality, the critic of utilitarianism says, should have nothing to do with expediency, and everything to do with principle. Well, the objection itself is confusing because what the utilitarian recommends is that we adopt and act on the principle of utility as our rule and guide in making moral decisions. So the objector either has in mind some other principle than utility, or the critic interprets the utilitarian principle as one that justifies only expedient behavior or expedient policies. If no other competing moral principle has been mentioned, then we can put the first alternative aside and concentrate on the second. Does the utilitarian justify expedient behavior or policies? Now, the dictionary definition of expedience is a means of attaining an end, especially one that is convenient but considered improper or immoral. That's from the Cambridge Dictionary. The question is whether the utilitarian principle could be used to justify improper or immoral means to attaining an end. Mill uses the example of telling a lie for the purpose of getting over some momentary embarrassment or attaining some object immediately useful to oneself or others. So let's think about that. Let's think about telling a lie for the purpose of getting over some momentary embarrassment, or telling a lie in order to attain some object immediately useful to ourselves or to others. But these purposes don't justify the lie. Lies may sometimes be useful for the person who tells the lie, but such lies are generally hurtful to others. Lies, Mill says, weaken the trustworthiness of human assertion. Mill's warning about the damage that lies can make to the trustworthiness of human assertion is especially important to heed in the 21st century, when lies are not only rapidly transmitted to millions of people, but they are sometimes told by people in positions of political power who we expect to be trustworthy. This is not to deny that there may be exceptions to the rule that we ought to tell the truth, sacred as it is. The withholding of the truth might be necessary to save other persons from great and unmerited evil, and when the withholding can only be effected by the denial. Thus, that's a quote from Mill. Thus, it is justifiable on grounds of utility for a captured prisoner in time of war to withhold facts from the enemy, which, if not withheld, could result in the death of hundreds of his fellow soldiers. Mill says this: if the principle of utility is good for anything, it must be good for weighing these conflicting utilities against one another and marking out the region within which one or the other preponderates. Page 23. I'm sorry I said that a bit accurately. I'll repeat it. If the principle of utility is good for anything, it must be good for weighing these conflicting utilities against one another and marking out the region within which one or the other preponderates. Page 23 of Utilitarianism. And as a sidebar, I say at page 44 of my book, Mill's justification of telling a lie to prevent a great and unmerited evil is at odds with his predecessor Immanuel Kant's proclamation that it is always morally wrong to tell a lie. We'll see, you might go back and look at the discussion we had in Chapter 1. Mill and Kant have a serious objection to one another on this example of telling a lie. Mill standing firmly behind the utility principle, saying that utility sometimes dictates that we tell a lie, especially in a situation where we can save a life. Kant says no. He's an absolutist. You can never tell a lie. Why he says that is something we'll have to get into later, not now. So I'm going to end there. We've had 18 minutes, almost 19 minutes now, and we'll look at the final words of this chapter at the next reading. See you then, and thanks for listening.